Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 338. If you understood what it was like to be a people manager, would it make you a better individual contributor? Would you treat your manager differently as a result? Daniel Paluszek is a principal partner technology strategist at ServiceNow, but he was once a people manager. And even though that role was only for a short time in his career, the experience made a lasting impression. If you missed part one of our discussion with Daniel in episode 337, we spoke about his early career, working in the help desk, and getting an internship that got him into government contracting. We talked about the importance of mentoring, and Daniel shared some thoughts on public speaking. We also took the time to define what technology partnerships and go-to-market strategies really are. In part two of our discussion with Daniel this week, we're going to talk about what it was like to work in professional services, doing some pre-sales work and post-sales work by working with larger and larger customers, all the way to customers we would call service providers. We'll talk about the role Daniel had as a people leader and the things he learned from that. But I want you to listen really closely for when Daniel turns the mic on John during our discussion. It's a great moment. We'll also talk about why Daniel chose to step out of people leadership and go back to the individual contributor side of the house. Let's get you to part two of our discussion with Daniel Paluszek. And I would imagine you got to bring some of your government-focused work to some of those conversations that made it a little bit easier to build relationships with those folks that your sales rep had great relationships with as well.
Absolutely. I think that not only having that industry view, while federal government and defense contracting is definitely different, I think it gives you a level of expertise that does cascade to any government organization. And at that time, too, when I joined the partner, the whole big thing was vSphere consolidation, physical to virtual migrations. And that's what I was doing over and over again previously. And so I had direct exposure and expertise on actually orchestrating that from end to end, designing it, building it, migrating, then providing the day two run book on how the organization would actually run it. So coincidentally, I had the direct exposure. I didn't have the, I would say, interpersonal sales consultative skills, but that was something that I was able to work with my sales leader, and he mentored me along the way. And I did the work, the professional services. We had a team that also helped. It wasn't just me, but we'd work together as a team on solving these large solutions and then making it work, doing the work. And I did professional services for that partner for several years, and then joined Cisco Systems when they launched the Unified Compute System, or UCS compute platform, and did professional services at Cisco for several years. I think all that experience was able to solidify all the different industries, the different dynamic situations, getting those at-bats that I discussed before. PS it's a tough job. It's a challenging job. Typically in large professional services organizations, you have somebody that scopes the work, not necessarily as the person that produces or executes the statement of work. Okay, they scoped it, but there could have been a potential challenge around misscoping where this expectation was set and it wasn't set in the statement of work. How do you mitigate that, but also overcome those challenges? Customer might have had the perception that this was going to be done, but our contract says this. You had to work through these situations and challenges on an ongoing basis to overcome this, but not only make your customer happy, do what's right, but also make your organization healthy from a profit and loss perspective, because companies and PS organizations, their largest cost factor is people. If they're not able to achieve profitability in projects, that's just going to erode their growth targets and also any revenue numbers that they're trying to seek.
And just a clarification point, when you were with the consulting firm before Cisco, you were 100% pre-sales related to consulting and not any implementation. Is that accurate? Or was it a mix of both?
It was a mix of both. It was a hybrid role. I was brought in initially as a professional services engineer, and then I got started getting exposed to the pre-sale side of things because that was one of the desires that I had. I wanted to learn the pre-sale side. That was something that I aspired to. So as I continued on in my tenure there, I was able to start scoping out the work or presenting with customers and then subsequently delivering the work. So I wore both hats.
Yeah, that's just a really good point for our listeners to know. If you go and work for one of these partners or a company that has a professional services arm, ask and figure out, is it pre-sales? Is it post-sales? Is it both? And maybe both is a way for you to decide if you prefer one or the other. It sounds like that helped you decide.
It did. And I also think that doing both and then doing professional services delivery for many years also shaped me into the individual I am today, because I had to live and go through delivery of projects. And so when I scoped it, I knew exactly, hey, I ran into this a couple engagements ago. I knew that this is something to watch out from a field level direct exposure perspective. So I knew the nuances to my area of expertise, my domain, and I was able to scope it in a way that ensured success and mitigated that risk just because I had that direct experience. That doesn't scale for large organizations, candidly. Sometimes I've seen organizations switch between bringing from delivery to pre-sales to kind of ensure that you round out your experience. But I had that opportunity to do both during that period of time and also continue on that journey to gain exposure into these different areas.
It's funny that you say that because there's another level of complexity and even separation of roles above that, right? Where you completely abstract out the pre-sales role. What we will do is sell you, quote unquote, a professional services engagement to get this done. And in order to figure out exactly what that looks like, I will bring in an architect who will scope the professional services engagement and then assign a level of effort and hours of work and put a statement of work together and maybe assign a dollar figure to that. And then there's yet another third person who's actually doing the execution. It might even be more people than that, but it's three distinct roles. Somebody who's selling a solution that includes professional services, somebody who scopes the professional services, and then somebody who executes the professional services.
That's correct. You're right.
You can probably slice it up even more than that. I've even seen in organizations who will have almost like design workshops to talk about, the possibilities of design. And even that, like presenting those types of workshops is completely separate from actually writing the statement of work. There's one group that goes out and does the workshop to get the inputs on the statement of work. And then another group that writes the statement of work and has like maybe more expertise at that process and interaction with the people who are executing. So again, if we're talking about roles and educating people about roles, the number of different types of roles that are out there just continue to amaze me. And, going to school, I have no idea how you'd know any of these roles existed.
That's spot on, John. And especially for large enterprises or what I would consider multi-pillar transformational solutions, so that take multiple facets of the business, you're going to have multiple different SMEs associated to a specific domain or technology that have to roll up to an architecture, to an engagement manager. And, starting off my career in that consulting, I was working with, I would consider, smaller organizations and some larger ones too in state departments. But when I went to Cisco Systems, that opened my eyes to these very large enterprises and service providers that needed assistance on transforming how they operated a large percentage of their business that actually drove revenue for them. Seeing that and seeing the complexity, there were engagements that I would have to design that dealt with dozens of individuals, if not hundreds, that would deliver over a potentially multi-year period. I would say I was very fortunate to start off kind of at that foundational fundamental level and gain that experience and keep on moving up the stack into these different industries and different experiences.
Can you just define for listeners what we mean when we say service provider?
Yeah. So a service provider in the industry could mean somebody that is providing a service. It could be in the traditional sense, like a cable provider that provides telecommunications service to an end user or a consumer. In the business market, a managed service provider or service provider is providing a discrete service that is injected into that customer's business. Let's say it's business process outsourcing, BPO, which in essence means, are we processing all of their potentially accounts payable and accounts receivable? How are they transacting on their business from POs and invoices? Could be an MSP or a service provider that is providing service desk operations for an end customer. So in B2B terms, they're providing a discrete or explicit service that operates as a function of the overall company's organization that helps them scale. So if you think it from a customer point of view, many customers have services they provide. Let's just pick on retail, for example. They're there to sell products and goods, right? That is their core business, is to drive incremental sales and revenue of products. Could be clothing, shoes, whatever it might be. Everything else around that business to operate that business is context. How they manage their back-end IT systems, how they manage maybe their service desk or their finance and supply chain. Sometimes they will in-house that. And in some cases, they'll partner with a service provider or a GSI to help them provide that line of business. And so it really ultimately comes down to what is your core business and what's your context, and making that decision on, is this something we want to staff and scale in-house, or do we want to partner with somebody that's going to provide this as a service to us?
And then you might have someone who sits in-house who is like the interface with that service provider to make sure business operations work as needed, right? Like someone who works with the payroll provider, for example.
That's right. There's always an interface from the customer, and typically, even as a service provider, and not generalizing the enterprise, but typically you will see a small team that manages that line of business. And then they work with a partner or service provider that provides the execution, or 80 or 90% of that load to provide that end service. So they interface with the leaders or the accountable stakeholders that run that function. And then that feeds into the overall business strategy.
I like how you talked about the progression of a small partner doing services engagements there, and then at Cisco for these larger companies. And in the service provider world, we're talking about a service provider who has many end customers. So it creates a greater availability need of the systems that they have that you have to fit the services into so that you get the right solution that doesn't disrupt that for all their customers. It's not just internal business-facing systems, it's customer-facing systems too.
That's right. I covered at Cisco service providers, and in their terminology, that was telco telecommunications, media, and technology partners, or TMT, the industry term on that. But I covered a lot of the telecommunications providers. Talk about just systems upon systems and just distributed that do certain functions. It was just incredible and eye-opening to see how these telecommunications service providers provide just a handset, what it takes to do that, and just the network functions associated to that. And getting exposed to that was incredible. And at that time too, I'm not in that space right now, but the big thing was network function virtualization, or NFV, which is probably still around, I'm sure, in some form or factor. But that was the big emerging next generation technology, was how do we consolidate, apply what we did to monolithic discrete apps to network functions and virtualize these for service providers to gain consolidation, efficiency outcomes for providers, and providing a better experience for consumers and the customer.
Now, in this role at Cisco is when you went 100% toward the pre-sales side of services. Is that accurate, or was it still a hybrid?
At Cisco, I had a few roles. I started off as a delivery individual within the data center and cloud group. And then I moved up fast, and I became a practice manager for a little bit. And so I managed a team of about 14 individuals. So that was my first foray into people leadership. It was an interesting and incredible experience. And I would say managing people and leading people, and I was mentoring some people at that time. But when you get into people leadership, that's a totally different approach and perspective. I had to really focus on, I'm there to support the people that work on our organization and ensure that they're successful in their goals and their projects, and unblock anything that they need. What I had to change my mindset on was putting the people that work for me first and ensuring that they get everything they need, feed that upstream on what's the current state of affairs, what are the challenges, what do we need, and how do I ensure their success. So I did that for a little bit before I had the opportunity to go more of a pure services seller role. And so I then moved over from practice management to a pre-sales role inside of the data center and cloud group.
What was that transition like to go full-time in one role? And especially, in light of going from kind of people management to back to individual contributor?
If I look back on that, you have to have the right mindset to manage and lead individuals from all different backgrounds and experiences, and also realize that everybody operates differently. And I think at that time, I don't know if I was fully ready for that position. And I was still pretty young in my career journey. I think I was asked to take this role, and I learned a lot, and I did a good job, and I kept in touch with a lot of the people that I managed. But it was something that gave me a different perspective, which was priceless, on managing people, and also providing a view into people leadership that I never had before. And we will all work for managers, and sometimes we take for granted. It gave me a unique exposure into what our managers deal with and how a corporate hierarchy also works within an organization, a large organization. So I look back at that, and I think I'm probably more self-critical of my time and my performance on that. It was something that I learned a lot from. I don't think I was ready at that time to lead people and manage people, if that makes sense. I really aspired to do more of the pre-sales solution architecture track. And I said, you know what? This is something that I've always aspired to do, but I'd like to move back over as in a pre-sales architecture role.
I think people maybe don't realize that the move to management usually involves like a pretty drastic career change, right? Even if it's being on a team and managing that team, your job is no longer doing the work. It's managing the people. And it sounds like that's something that you came across And maybe it's just the thing that in corporate America, like we just don't understand. When people talk about careers and they say, oh, I want to be a manager or a director, a senior director, vice president, CTO, CIO, whatever, like they don't know what they mean because they're looking at it from the bottom of the pyramid, looking at up the stack of management, not understanding that management doesn't have anything to do with the actual work that they're doing. And it's not totally disconnected. It's just different and separated.
I agree. And management and people leadership is a diametric difference, especially for technology professionals. When you get into management, you almost have to let go of the technology reins because that's not your job anymore. And I think personally at that time, I wasn't ready to let go of that. I think that was part of my challenge internally that I struggled with. Yes, I'm aspiring to be a people leader and a manager, but for you to become a successful people leader, you have to let go of the technology and having that skill because that's not your job anymore. It's a totally different mindset I have now, just because of what I've learned since then. But I was presented that opportunity and I took it, did the best to my abilities. And I said, it's okay to say, this isn't for me right now. It's not saying that the door's closed. I just don't feel like I was ready personally for that role at that time.
Yeah, it's the right solution at the wrong time is still, The word wrong comes up. One of the things that I found moving into people leadership, it's almost like this facepalm moment of like, oh, now I know how to be a really good individual contributor. Having seen from the management view of what people are doing. And, maybe some organizations are just not explicit about how they're measuring people and it's just not clear or you don't understand the different priorities or metrics that people are measured by. It's like, oh, if I'd only known this or I'd only known this job before, then I would have been so much better at that past job.
Agreed.
So maybe I'm asking you, was that stint at management, did that make you a better individual contributor knowing what managers were measuring?
1,000%. Because I was naive in the sense of what my manager in the past had to go through. Putting yourself in that role, you realize very quickly it's sink or swim. And what do you have to deal with? What are your priorities on that? So I, took away from that experience having a level of empathy for every manager I've ever worked with since then, because you just take it for granted because you've never seen it before. And so when you come out of, or you're in people leadership and managing people, just gives you a totally different mindset. And I just don't think individual contributors understand that and realize that until they're in those shoes. I'm very grateful to have had that experience because you just have a level of empathy that says there are things that you're just not aware of. And until you experience it firsthand, you're not going to see it.
But sometimes, a manager takes a leave of absence or they're on family leave or something like that. And an individual on the team is asked, or, the team's asked for volunteers who can fill in. Even if you have no aspirations to be a manager, I think it would be valuable to volunteer or be an acting manager, because if your only aspiration is to be the best version of and the highest performing individual contributor in your role that you could be, doing a stint with a defined endpoint as acting manager, it'd be like, adding nitro to like a race car, right? You will just be in a position to do a better job.
I agree. And I think being a team lead also helps your manager too on guiding the up and coming individuals and mentoring. So one thing I took away from my stint in management was I initially thought, well, this is my path of progression, for me to move up from an individual contributor to manager and continue on this journey. And I realized you don't have to be a manager to help others. It doesn't matter if they're on your team or not. Mentoring and guidance crosses any logical boundary. Doesn't matter where you live, what company you work with. Helping others and helping them with their journey and their success doesn't matter where they are. You can do that. And The one thing that I really enjoy is helping others with their aspirations, just mentoring them on their professional and personal journeys. And that was one thing from management you had to do, right? Along with all the administrative functions. And I think that component of it and guiding and providing a different perspective, objective perspective, just greatly helps others with their progression and what they're trying to achieve for their outcomes. And you don't have to be a manager or a people leader for that. You can just be a good professional that helps others.
I'll put in an endorsement on even helping out with the administrative overhead, because I never had as much of an understanding of what a nightmare it is to not have all your people put in their Salesforce updates or have their different, things done by the time that everybody says that they need to have it done, and update this field and not do that. Is like, until you are aggregating 10 people's worth of, oops, I forgot, you have no appreciation for the person that you never have to ask to get their stuff in on time.
Agreed. John, you're a manager right now. Is that correct? You're in a people leadership role?
Yes. First time sales engineering leader. Been a couple of years. So.
Okay. The other thing I had to experience, and I'm curious to see how you've dealt with it, when individuals aren't meeting their core responsibilities. And as a manager, I had to deal with people that weren't meeting their obligations and their core responsibilities for the job that they were assigned to. And that was quite the learning experience for me, because you had to learn how to have these tough and challenging conversations with individuals that are going to be on the defensive. I'm curious to see what would be words of wisdom for somebody that would move into that and how to deal with those tough and challenging conversations.
Well, first of all, I would say really good practice for it is when you work on cross-functional teams where there's a dependency and you don't have managerial or role power over somebody, right? But you still need to hold them accountable for work that they say they're going to get done for the team effort or the cross-functional team effort. And so before being a manager, I was, an account sales engineer, and I would have to deal with partner SEs and overlay SEs. And, we were all working on one campaign together, but it really fell to me as the core account sales engineer to be the project manager on conducting this orchestra of overlays. And that included technical account managers or dedicated support engineers, like, any number of things, residents that the customer had bought. And I think that it's really good practice to have those kinds of conversations before you become a manager. I don't think that it's good to have that be, part of your core job without having ever done it before. So holding people accountable in a way, especially when you don't have role power over it, like you can't write them up, you can't give them a negative job review, you have no real power, but you do have the power of persuasion. And, some of us are in pre-sales roles, so sometimes you have to sell them on the idea that they just need to do better and commit to it. And then, once you're actually in that role, then you have to have the overall responsibility of making sure that there's clarity on what those job expectations are. Just because it's published and just because people look at it once a year doesn't mean that they've internalized it. And sometimes those job descriptions and responsibilities are written in very broad brushstrokes. So you have to say, well, as it applies to us in our job function, this is what we need to do. And some of the explicit administrative, tactical, day-to-day, week-to-week things are, you need to do this by this time. You need to do these tasks to this quality. And it has to be in writing eventually at some point. Like if it's lack of clarity on that, then it just needs to be in writing. Even just sending somebody an email saying, hey, I just need to follow up with you and make sure that you understand these are the core, job responsibilities. Like that can be seen as an aggressive act. So you have to also build up the relationship with the person to make sure that they understand the context that things are coming, to them in. Secondly, you have to make sure that they have the tools to be able to accomplish this. those two things have to be clear before you can even like hold somebody's feet to the fire and say, hey, you're not doing this. The first response is, I didn't know that I had to do that. And then the second response is, if I have to do that, I don't have the things that I need to do to get that done. It's almost like this, you have to solve things and address them in chronological order, from cause to effect. But, there's also coaching. There's this book that, I bring up in these conversations a lot, which is called The Talent Code. And it addresses like the John Wooden coaching method, which is like, hey, this is how you do it. This is what you were doing, but this is how you do it. It's not the like praise, critique, praise. It's this is what good looks like. This is what you were doing. And then this is what good looks like again. I feel like you pulled the chain on my brain dump on giving people feedback.
I turned this around on you. I bring that up because in my stint as a manager, I had to deal with a few challenging situations, and that definitely put me and exposed me to very uncomfortable conversations. And that was a pretty raw learning experience. And so I was curious to see what words of wisdom you would give, again, coming out of that with just empathy and understanding for managers at all levels. And I think that's one thing that many of us in the tech industry, you've been in IC for a while, you just don't realize, and you're not just aware of that level of responsibility managers have to go through on a daily basis. So treat your managers very well. That's all I have to say.
Well, it's an important skill to have. Like I said, whether you're a manager or whether you're working cross-functional teams, all of us have found at one point or another, we are dependent on somebody outside of our direct reporting chain to do something in order for us to get our job done. It might be somebody who their reporting chain meets the CEO of the company, only at the very last, C-level reports. You're in one C-level executives in an organization and they're in another organization, and you still need them to do something in order for you to be able to do your thing. So you still need to be able to cultivate that influence. There's this training called Crucial Conversations, and there's a book, Crucial Conversations, and it's how to have those difficult conversations, because it's not just managers that have those. All of us have them.
Yep.
Parents have them with children. Spouses have them with each other. As children, adult children, we sometimes have to have them with our parents. Everybody has these difficult conversations. It's yet another skill.
Absolutely.
And you don't want to be a novice at that skill when it's, the most important time to have that conversation.
Daniel, you talked about moving from the people manager role to individual contributor because you missed being close to the technology. I'm really curious about how the interview went for the individual contributor role and how much of your management experience you were asked to talk about in terms of transferable skills from that back to individual contributor. As you said, you have to focus on the people, maybe less so than the technology. So is it a strike against you when you try to go back to the individual contributor path?
It's a great question. Since I was in the same business unit organization, my team was delivering on the same services that the pre-sales team was delivering on. We worked hand in hand on that. So I had the delivery expertise, the pre-sales expertise. They also realized that I had some people leadership experience. I can't recall if they ever asked me about why are you switching from, went from IC to manager, now you desire to go back to IC. There was probably a question or two on what's your desire here? What's your interest on that? I think the simple terms was I wanted to get closer to the customer and closer to the solutions and technology. And that was my passion at that time. I don't recall beyond that, since it was all part of the same organization. It was, I would say, a fairly seamless transition for me, since it was all internal at Cisco Systems. Thinking through that, you're a manager for many years, right? Going back to IC, I can see, just like any other skill, it does degrade over time. But, in the industry, I've seen people move from management to IC back to management. I think if you have the right qualities, the ability to take on those responsibilities and ensure you have the right frame of mind, especially when you transition from IC to manager. Your people come first, and ensuring their success and realizing that is your first priority for a successful organization. So I think it rounds out an individual and a professional from my perspective. Maybe that's my confirmation bias, right? Because I did that. But if I could replay that or go back in time, and if you asked me, would I have passed on the people leadership opportunity at that time? I would have still done the same thing, because the end result was I learned a significant amount of direct exposure and experience that I wouldn't have gained without going through and understanding that role and responsibility, and making me a better leader at the end result too. And, I think John eloquently put this as, while individual contributors don't have that direct role and responsibility assignment for managing people, cross-functional leader has to bring together a collaborative team, ensure clarity, accountability. Those are key factors to a cross-functional leader. And then still having those tough conversations when somebody isn't holding their end of the agreement. Every career journey ebbs and flows. So I think everybody has a varied path on how they experience these things. It's probably a very long-winded way of answering your question, Nick.
I love the way you answered that question, because what I heard was your exposure to being in the role actually did allow you to transfer all those skills and be a leader in your new role. And to me, it's just a transfer of the empathy. You transfer that empathy to the people you work with, to your customer, and again, your industry experience, just like when you worked with the government entity and were able to transfer that to the consulting role. That experience as a people manager is something that is very relatable to someone in a pre-sales role who is going to interface with people at different levels within an organization. So knowing what that's like might give you a little bit different perspective on the person on the other side of the Zoom or the physical conference room that you're in, lunch table, whatever it is, that you maybe can't really understand if you've always been an individual contributor.
You said it a lot better than I did.
Well, I'm saying it as an individual contributor who really hasn't ever been a manager. I really appreciate that perspective. I love the answers.
Could we maybe talk about the next job transition over to, it looks like, HPE SimpliVity? I'm just wondering what that was like, because that was kind of like a hot new technology at the time. To be in the type of position that you were in and then change organizations and employers and be in kind of like a brand new technology wave, just like you were participating in the virtualization technology wave. Was that a conscious choice?
You heard this theme of scaling experience, what I called a steady build. Daniel didn't just start working with service providers as soon as he got into professional services. He didn't have the level of expertise to work with a customer at that scale. He got the exposure through what he calls at-bats, the ability to work with customers of different sizes in different industries. Even though he might have been talking to them about the same technology, they had different problems, different compliance needs, different automation needs, different ways and use cases for that technology. And those environments that he worked in, or customer environments, just became larger and larger. And he told us about the nuance of scoping a professional services engagement for a very large customer. You have to figure out what kind of expertise is needed for the people who will do the professional services work to solve the problem that the customer has and deliver the outcome that the customer needs. If you're not exposed to these types of environments, these types of use cases, the type of scale a particular environment has, you might not know how to deal with that. So one way you can develop in your career even if you're doing the same job, is begin to scale that experience to larger and larger environments, or environments in different industries, or maybe environments that are a bit more nuanced or support a different business unit even. All of those things might make what you do with the technology, how it's configured, what the operational runbook is, look very, very different, but you can learn a lot from it. One of my favorite comments in that episode was John's mention of filling in for your manager. Even if you have no desire to be a people manager at any point in your career, what if you actually did volunteer to fill in for that manager sometime? Volunteer with the intent to understand what your manager does on a deeper level. Understand how they need to communicate with their leadership. Because even though you may never want to do that job, you may want to understand better how to communicate with upper level leaders about the things that you're doing. This is your chance. You're going to get to interact with your skip level leaders. And maybe it gives you a little bit more empathy about what the path of people management is like. Who knows? You might find out you like it. You certainly might find out it's not for you because you're going into this with the intent that it's not for you. But once you have that experience, like John said, you can use that experience, the knowledge you gain, to become a better individual contributor. And if you do decide to do something like this, go ask questions about the experience you had while filling those shoes for your manager while they were out of office or couldn't handle something. Debrief on it. Ask about some of the context around the situations you found yourself in, and you never know what you might learn to help you on your way. We also talked quite a bit about empathy. Daniel learned a lot about that when he was in people leadership. One of my favorite episodes to go back to when we're talking about empathy is episode 278 with Marnie Coffey. She talked about how her greatest skill was empathy and how she uncovered that it was her greatest skill. Maybe you're listening to this and you need to be more empathetic. And maybe it takes getting exposed to what someone else does or really understanding where they're coming from for you to have that empathy. Maybe you've just been going too hard, too fast, and you haven't really been listening and paying attention to what's going on around you. Take some of that in, take the time, and be a little more empathetic. You might just surprise yourself. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of our discussion with Daniel. Next week, we have the conclusion of Daniel's story in part 3, and you'll get to hear why he chose to make the move from an established company to a hyper-growth startup. We'll catch you then.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at BJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.